A complex number is generally written in the form z is equal to a plus bi, where a is called the real part of the complex number, and b is called the imaginary part of the complex number, and I is the square root of -1. Note that this is generally the way that mathematicians write a complex numbers. Engineers use j instead of I. Recall that in MATLAB, both I and j are built-in constants for the square root of -1. So I could create a complex variable, for example, z1, by saying it's 2 plus 3i. And you see that's the way that MATLAB would give it back to us. MATLAB always gives it in terms of I rather than in terms of j. Or we could create a complex number by having it be the square root of a negative number. There are a few functions that work with complex numbers that we'll use. Complex will return a complex number given the real and the imaginary parts. So we pass the two things to it, the real and imaginary parts, and it will create the complex number. Real and imag basically do the reverse. So real returns the real part of a complex number. Imag, you pass to it a complex number, and it will return the imaginary part. There are three other functions that you should remember about when you cover these complex numbers later on in your mathematics and engineering classes, but we're not really going to use them in EK 127 for now. Conj returns the complex conjugate of a complex number. ABS returns the absolute value, or in other words, the magnitude. And angle returns the angle of a complex number in polar form. To display a complex number, you have several options. If you use DISP, DISP will display the entire complex number. fprintf, by default, will only display the real part of the complex number. If you want to plot, there are several options. You can plot only the real parts using plot. You can plot the real versus the imaginary parts using plot. And you can plot the real and imaginary parts in one figure with a legend using plot. And finally, you can plot the magnitude and angle using a special function called polar.